All right, so we have went through our first little activity where we created a project, went through the onCreate method of the main activity, which sets up our screen and then prints out a little hello world message. Okay, so we want to go into get into a little bit more detail of what's happening inside the code. This main activity, it extends this class called app_compat_activity. These are all Android APIs, so you can go and study the Android API on the particulars of each one of these classes. This one contains several methods, and one of which is called onCreate. It will call the superclasses, which is this guy, this app_compat_activities, onCreate, and pass to it the instance state. We'll talk about context and instance states in class, but just know that it's just kind of like what the current state and variables and different characteristics of the app is, so that you can move around between screens and launch different types of features while you're inside your app. Like for example, could launch like a you could launch the Google Maps or something like that. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to create a new class which will help us with the database. So we're going to be, like I said before in the first video, we're going to be creating this contact database that will hold name, phone number, address, right? So you can put as many fields as you want in that, but in order to keep that in a nice organized manner, we can create records inside a database. And this database we're going to be using is what's called SQL. We'll talk more about it in detail, what it stands for and how it works in class, but I'll give you some basics on how we're going to get the code up and running here. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to create a new class, and we're going to do it inside the package that has our main activity class in it. So we go into the Java folder inside the com example blah blah blah, and we want to create a new, and we want to create a Java class. So we say new and then Java class, and then inside that I want to call this one database helper. So it's going to help us with the database, and it's a class, and we're going to be extending. So the superclass is going to be SQL caps light and then open helper. And as you type, you can see it kind of creates an autocomplete, and so that's helpful if you aren't a very good typer. So you can type that in, and then you can click on it, and it's going to give us this SQLite open helper. This is going to allow us, again, access to the parent class's methods. We're going to put it in this package, and the visibility we want to be public, modifiers none, so we keep that default, and then we hit OK. All right, so it will create this this class here and brings it up. And then you can see that we've got some errors in it. So this is just like Eclipse, where it gives you kind of like the underline or the red marks there. And if you hover over there, it will give you some hints on what might be the problem. So in this one, we have to do some imports of the appropriate classes in order to get this thing to work. So we want to do what's called a quick fix. So if we are on a PC, if you can click on the database, that word database helper, and you can click, then you hold down the Alt key and then you hit enter, right? So Alt enter, and it will give you some options. Okay, if you're on a Mac, you want to do the you click on the word, you hit that, you hold down Option and you hit enter, and then you should see something that's looks like this. You have a pull-down menu that gives you some options. Okay, so the one that we want is we want to implement the method. So we click on Implement Methods, and then what will come up is the methods to implement that we have our choices from, and we want these two, the onCreate and onUpgrade. So the onCreate, again, is kind of like your launch method, kind of like your main that we had in the main activity. So each activity is like a screen on the phone or on the tablet, and so as we're going back and forth between different classes, those would be like activities, and so inside each one of those, we need an onCreate method. That would be like the main method that gets launched when you switch over from one screen to another. Okay, so I'll show you how that works when we start again building up the app and we start showing different screens that pop up when we're adding contacts or viewing different contacts. Okay, so I want to implement both these, the onCreate and the onUpgrade, and so I hit OK. All right, so now we have those two there. We still have an error in here, and so it's basically saying that it doesn't have a default constructor. So I want to click on it again, and I want to do my quick fix. So again, it's Alt and Enter if you're a PC, or Option Enter if you're a Mac, and you say Create Constructor Matching Super. So we want to create that. So again, we have a class, we need a constructor, and you'll get two options. One will have, I think it's like 4 different entries, and then the other one will have more. We want the one with 4 entries, so we click on that top one, and then we hit OK, and then you're going to get the constructor. Okay, so now we have a class in here that doesn't have any errors, at least off the top. This one's called Database Helper. It's sort of grayed out because we're not using it yet anywhere. We're extending this class called SQLite Open Helper. We have a constructor here. This is our Database Helper constructor. And then we have our onCreate method and onUpgrade. So this is going to be, onCreate would be like creating the database. OnUpgrade would be if the database changes, and SQL is a structured, it's called structured query language for databases that is cloud. It can be cloud-based. You can have stuff up in the cloud, and if the version of the database gets updated, you want to make sure you update your database down on the individual devices. So you have a method called onUpgrade as well. All right, so what we want to do then is we want to create some stuff in here. We've got our constructor here, but we want to create some variables in here that will allow us to access some of the fields in the database. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to create some public static final variables. So I'm going to say public, and then static, and then final, and I'm going to say from the first one it's going to be an integer, so int, and then I'm going to call this one database underscore version. And this is important when we are doing our kind of build up of the database. We bump the version every time we maybe add a new field. You need to do that so that the database is allowed to update its records to have the same number of fields in it. So I'm just going to start with number 1. Then I'm going to put in another public static final, and I'm going to put a string in here, and it's going to be called database and then name, and I'm going to call that contact, and then I'm going to call that, I don't know, whatever. I called my thing 2, right? Contact 2 2018, so you can call it whatever you want. Contact database. .db for database. And I'm going to put that in quotes because it's a string. And here I need to say this is going to be equal to 1 to initialize it. Okay, that's that string. And then I have another public static final string. And this one's going to be called my table name. And we'll see how we're going to be using these in just a minute. Contact 2 2018 underscore table. Okay, so this is my table name. And then what I want is then another one called public static final. And I think what I'll pause and add these couple things in here, then I'll come back. All right, so I just added a couple different fields here. So I think we stopped at, before I went away, the table name, contact 2. Again, you can name it whatever you want here, just so that you remember it so you can get to it. Then I want to add an ID, so a public static final string ID called quotes ID. And then the last one I'm going to put in here is public static final string and I'm going to call this column name contact, and then it's going to be just called contact. Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to consolidate this stuff into a string that will create the table entries. So I'm going to say public static final and then another string. And this one's going to be called SQL create entries. And this is going to be equal to, and I'll explain this in just a second. Let me go away and then I'll type this out and then I'll explain how it goes through. Okay, so we created a string entry called SQL create entries, and it has this string, and it's pretty important that you have this formatting exactly the way this is here with the spaces in here, and this is because we are going to be using a method called SQL exec, and let me see if I can get that up here. This one is called, we're going to execute an SQL, this is the exec SQL method. Okay, so we enter a string, and then we have some arguments here that we bind to it. The one that we're going to be using is this thing called drop or create table. These ones here are used to basically to create the database table, and then when we upgrade it, we may drop it, we may change it, something like that. Okay, so we're going to be you're going to be using this string as part of this method call, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But to set that up, we want to create the string here, the entries, and that will be the command that we're going to use in SQL will be called create table, and then we're going to have a space in here, and then we're going to concatenate in the table name, concatenate in quote space and then the parentheses, and then we're going to put in the ID, so we concatenate in the ID plus, so concatenate, and then we have a quote with a space in there because we need spaces in between this stuff, right? Otherwise it all kind of clubs it all together. And we use these keywords: integer, primary, key, auto increment. This is how the IDs, when I showed the first record, had an ID of 1, and then if I had another record, it had an ID of 2, and so on. Then it would auto increment. And then we wanted to put in the contact name in the text there. Okay, so once we get that in there, then we can add in the call to the execution SQL or exec SQL.